In the winter of 1405, the most powerful man in Europe refused to bathe for 5 months. Not out of laziness, not out of rebellion, but out of terror. Terror that the slightest touch might cause his body to explode into 1,000 glittering fragments. This is the story of Charles VI of France, a king who believed he was made of glass, and the extraordinary lengths he went to protect himself from a fate that existed only in his fractured mind. December 3rd, 1368. In Paris, a child is born who will one day command armies, sign treaties that reshape Europe, and live in constant fear of his own reflection. Charles VI enters the world as heir to the most powerful throne in medieval Europe, but he carries within him a darkness that will transform him from Charles the Beloved into Charles the Mad. At 11 years old, Charles becomes King of France. The crown weighs heavy on his small head, heavier than he could ever imagine. For now, his uncles rule as regents, squandering the kingdom's wealth while young Charles watches and learns. But in 1388, at 21, he seizes control. The young king proves brilliant. He dismisses his corrupt uncles, recalls his father's wise advisors, the Marmousets, and ushers in an era of prosperity. France flourishes. The people adore him. Charles the Beloved, they call him. But fate has other plans. August 5th, 1392. The forest of Le Mans. A military expedition that will change everything. Charles rides with his army to punish Pierre de Craon, who attempted to murder his friend Olivier de Clisson. But something is wrong. Witnesses describe the king as fevered, disconnected, speaking in fragments that make no sense. Then, from the shadows, a barefoot leper in rags rushes toward the king's horse, grabbing the bridle with desperate hands. "Ride no further, noble king. Turn back. You are betrayed." The king's escorts beat the man back, but he follows for half an hour, repeating his warning. At noon, emerging from the forest's oppressive darkness, a drowsy page drops the king's lance. The metal clangs against a steel helmet. Charles shudders. His eyes go wide with terror and rage. "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy!" The King of France begins slashing wildly at his own companions. Steel meets flesh. Blood spatters the forest floor. The bastard of Polignac falls dead. Other knights follow. Charles fights with the fury of a man possessed until his chamberlain and soldiers wrestle him from his horse. Then, nothing. Charles collapses into a coma, his mind retreating to a place from which it will never fully return. When Charles awakens, he is no longer the same man. The episodes begin. Periods of complete disconnection from reality that will haunt him for the remaining 30 years of his life. In 1393, the king cannot remember his own name. He doesn't recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau, or his children. When she visits, he asks his servants who this strange woman is and orders them to give her whatever she needs so she'll leave him alone. In 1395, he becomes convinced he is Saint George, the dragon slayer. He recognizes his household staff, but treats his own family as strangers. Sometimes he runs howling through the corridors of the Hôtel Saint-Paul like a wolf, forcing servants to wall up entrances to prevent him from escaping into the streets of Paris. But the most extraordinary delusion is yet to come. Sometime around 1405, Charles VI develops the most bizarre belief in recorded royal history. He becomes convinced that his body, his arms, his legs, his torso, his very soul, is made entirely of glass. Imagine living every moment believing that a single wrong move, a careless gesture, an unexpected touch could cause you to shatter into countless pieces. This becomes Charles's reality, and his response is both heartbreaking and extraordinary. The king's daily routine transforms into an elaborate ritual of self-preservation. Charles begins spending entire days sitting completely motionless in his chambers, afraid that even the slightest movement might cause hairline fractures to spread across his glass skin. he develops an intricate system of communication with his servants. They must approach him only when absolutely necessary, moving with the delicacy of surgeons handling the most fragile specimen. No sudden movements, no unexpected sounds. Even their breathing must be controlled, lest the vibrations cause the Glass King to crack. But Charles doesn't simply avoid contact. He engineers his protection with the methodical precision of a man whose life depends on it. He commissions the royal tailors to create clothing unlike anything ever made for royalty. Iron rods are carefully sewn into the fabric of his garments, creating a hidden exoskeleton designed to prevent his glass body from breaking. Imagine the weight, pounds of metal pressing against his body with every movement, the constant reminder that he is fragile, breakable, one accident away from destruction. Yet Charles wears this burden gladly, convinced it's the only thing standing between him and complete annihilation. When the iron reinforcement isn't enough, Charles develops an even more extreme protection method. He wraps himself in layers upon layers of thick, cushioned blankets until he resembles a human cocoon more than a king. The process becomes a daily ceremony. Servants must approach with specific blankets in a precise order. First, the softest wool against his glass skin. Then, progressively thicker layers, each one positioned to create maximum cushioning. The final layer must be secured without any pulling or tugging that might stress his fragile form. Meals become logistical nightmares. How do you feed a king who believes he's made of glass and refuses to unwrap himself? Charles develops a system where servants must carefully create small openings in his blanket fortress, just large enough for spoonfuls of food to pass through. He eats like a hibernating animal, barely moving, terrified that the act of chewing might cause his glass jaw to shatter. In 1405, Charles's delusion reaches its most extreme manifestation. He refuses to bathe for 5 months, convinced that water will cause his glass body to dissolve or crack from thermal shock. His physical condition becomes horrifying. Lice infests his unwashed hair and beard. Open sores develop across his skin from the constant pressure of his iron-reinforced clothing and the lack of hygiene. The smell becomes so overwhelming that courtiers can barely stand to be in the same room. Yet still, Charles refuses any cleaning, any touch, any contact that might threaten his glass integrity. His physicians plead with him. They explain that his mortal flesh is rotting, that infection will kill him long before any imaginary glass breakage. But Charles has developed elaborate theories about his condition. He believes that glass, being pure and crystalline, cannot truly decay. The sores and smell, he insists, are merely surface impurities that will eventually fall away, leaving his perfect glass form intact. Finally, when Charles's condition becomes life-threatening, his physicians make a desperate decision. They will force the Glass King to bathe, regardless of his protests. It takes 6 men to hold him down. Charles screams that they are murdering him, that the water will cause him to explode into 1,000,000 pieces. He begs them to stop, promising anything, gold, land, pardons for their families, if they'll just let him remain intact. But the physicians persist. As warm water touches his skin for the first time in months, Charles goes silent. He stares at his arms, waiting for the cracks to appear, for his glass form to begin its inevitable destruction. When nothing happens, he doesn't feel relief. Instead, he becomes convinced that he's now made of a special, water-resistant glass that's even more precious and fragile than before. Charles's sleeping arrangements become another elaborate ritual of protection. He refuses to lie down normally, convinced that the pressure of his body weight against the mattress will cause him to shatter. Instead, he develops a complex system of pillows and supports that allow him to sleep in a semi-upright position, distributing his weight as evenly as possible. Each pillow must be positioned exactly. Too firm, and the pressure points might crack his glass ribs. Too soft, and he might sink in ways that stress his glass spine. Servants spend hours each night arranging and rearranging his sleeping fortress until Charles feels secure enough to attempt rest. But even sleep offers no escape. Charles suffers recurring nightmares where he shatters into countless pieces, each fragment reflecting a different aspect of his terror. He often wakes screaming, convinced that the dream shattering was real, frantically checking his body for cracks that exist only in his mind. But perhaps the most terrifying test of Charles's glass delusion occurs during what becomes known as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men, January 29th, 1393. Queen Isabeau organizes a celebration to lift the king's spirits. Charles and 5 courtiers dress as wild men, savage creatures covered in costumes of linen cloth, soaked in resinous wax and pitch, with frazzled hemp creating a shaggy, beast-like appearance. For Charles, putting on the costume becomes an ordeal. He's convinced that the rough hemp fibers might scratch his glass skin, that the wax might create pressure points that could cause fractures. Servants must apply each piece with the delicacy of master craftsmen, ensuring no sharp edges touch the glass king's precious form. The costumes are highly flammable, so torches are kept at a safe distance. But Charles's brother, Louis of Orléans, arrives late and drunk. He approaches with a lighted torch, either to identify the dancers or with more sinister intent. Fire erupts. The costumes become infernos. Panic spreads through the hall as flames consume human flesh. 4 men die horribly: Charles de Poitiers, Hugues de Guise, Ivan de Foix, and the Count of Joigny. Their burning genitals, according to one horrified witness, drop to the floor in streams of blood. Charles survives only because his 15-year-old aunt, the Duchess of Berry, throws her voluminous skirt over him, smothering the flames before they can consume the King of France. In the aftermath, as others tend to the dying and burned, Charles becomes obsessed with checking his glass body for fire damage. He's convinced that the heat must have caused thermal stress fractures, invisible cracks that will eventually cause him to shatter. He spends hours examining every inch of his skin, searching for evidence of damage that exists only in his tortured mind. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all is Charles's relationship with mirrors. In an age where polished metal serves as reflection, Charles becomes both fascinated and terrified by his own image. He develops elaborate rituals for looking at himself. First, he must approach the mirror from precisely the right angle to avoid creating stress fractures from the visual impact. He believes that seeing himself too suddenly might cause shockwaves that could shatter his glass form. When he does look, Charles spends hours examining his reflection for signs of damage, hairline cracks, stress patterns, areas where his glass body might be weakening. He becomes convinced he can see flaws that no one else notices, imperfections that prove his fragile nature. Eventually, mirrors must be removed from his presence entirely. The psychological stress of constantly checking for damage becomes too much even for the Glass King to bear. Important state documents had to be brought to him on special cushioned trays, positioned at precise distances so he could read them without the risk of paper cuts that might shatter his glass fingers. Even eating became a carefully choreographed performance. Charles insisted that all food be served at exactly room temperature. Too hot might cause thermal expansion and cracking. Too cold might make his glass body brittle. He chewed with the deliberate slowness of someone convinced that aggressive jaw movements might cause his glass teeth to explode. Court ceremonies transformed into surreal theater. Nobles learned to bow from precisely measured distances, their movements slow and deliberate to avoid creating air currents that might destabilize the Glass King. Conversations happened in whispers, lest the sound waves prove too intense for his crystalline constitution. While Charles battles his inner demons, France crumbles around him. The 100 Years' War with England rages on. Civil war erupts between the Burgundians and Armagnacs as nobles fight for control of the incapacitated king. In 1415, Henry V of England sees opportunity in France's chaos. At Agincourt, a French army of 20,000 faces 6,000 English soldiers. It should be a massacre of the English. Instead, France suffers one of the most devastating defeats in military history. 6,000 Frenchmen die. Only 400 English perish. By 1420, Charles's condition has deteriorated so completely that he signs the Treaty of Troyes, perhaps the most catastrophic agreement in French history. He disinherits his own son, declares him illegitimate, and names Henry V of England as his successor. France, for all practical purposes, ceases to exist as an independent nation. October 21st, 1422. Charles VI dies in Paris after ruling France for 42 years. Even in death, his delusion persists. He requests that his body be handled with extreme care during burial preparations, convinced that rough treatment might cause his glass corpse to shatter in the tomb. Today, we understand that Charles likely suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or perhaps porphyria. His glass delusion was a manifestation of profound mental illness, not supernatural curse or divine punishment. Charles was not alone in his crystalline terror. Across Europe, the glass delusion spread like a contagion of the mind. Princess Alexandra of Bavaria believed she had swallowed a glass piano as a child and spent her life walking with the careful precision of someone carrying a musical instrument inside her body. In Paris, a nobleman became convinced his buttocks were made of glass. He refused to sit for months, standing through meals, court ceremonies, even sleeping upright against walls. Why glass? In Charles's time, clear glass was still a miraculous new technology. People had never seen anything so transparent yet solid, so beautiful yet breakable. It represented the ultimate paradox of existence, something precious that could be destroyed in an instant, just like life itself, just like kingdoms, just like kings. Yet somehow, through all this madness, Charles continued to rule. The psychological toll on those around Charles was immense. Queen Isabeau lived in constant fear that she might accidentally touch her husband and cause him to shatter. Their children grew up believing their father was made of a different substance than other humans, that love itself was dangerous because it required contact their glass father could never allow. Servants developed their own elaborate rituals and superstitions. Some began to believe that they too might be partially made of glass, that prolonged exposure to the Glass King's condition was somehow contagious. Others reported nightmares where they accidentally broke their monarch, where the sound of shattering glass followed them through their daily duties. The entire machinery of French government adapted to accommodate one man's impossible delusion. When Charles VI finally died in 1422, his physicians noted something remarkable. In his final moments, as death approached, the Glass King seemed to forget his delusion. He reached out to touch his wife's hand, allowed his children to embrace him, permitted human contact for the first time in decades. Perhaps in facing the ultimate fragility, mortality itself, Charles finally understood that his glass delusion had been an elaborate defense against a much simpler truth. We are all breakable. We are all temporary. We are all one moment away from ending.